muddy.
Sometimes we can find things in there.
So it takes more studying than it does just reading.
Yeah, exactly. But maybe that's actually good, because then it has to resonate a little deeper.
But that's good, but it's work.
Exactly, and it's tiring.
Yeah. But I just wondered, what about German makes it translate into something muddy as it is?
Yeah.
I just got muddy about German, read other translations.
That
works, huh? That's all right.
And just while Jeremy speaks.
Yeah.
Just while Jeremy speaks.
I brought it. Okay.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Then we turn it off.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Are you also
I had German in college, and I didn't get very...
All right, welcome back, everybody. We're gonna start the afternoon portion of the conference. And we're going to start off with transparent self, trans symbolic meaning. Yes.
So much for undivided attention.
Yeah. Okay. So if everybody could. So we're going to start with transparent self, trans symbolic meaning, with Andrew Venezia. I'm pronouncing that Venezia right. Andrew is the co-founder of Felicity Consulting, bringing integral state training and awareness to business and organizations working to usher in an era of global human flourishing. He is the progenitor of the practice of dreaming and we dreaming, which draws on Tibetan Buddhism, the work of Eugene Genlin, or Genlin.
I don't know either, actually.
Okay.
Genlin?
Genlin.
I took a class with him.
Oh, okay. Integral polarity practice, intersubjective awareness, we-space practices, energy work, transpersonal and gestalt psychology, among other things. He has a master's degree in integral theory, for which he conducted a 2-year research project on we-space practices. He lives in Ghent, Belgium, with his daughter, Lucia. So, welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. And Sabrina as well for putting the conference on. Thank you all for being here. Welcome back from lunch. Transparent self, trans-symbolic meaning. So press the home.
Oh, no, it's different than Athens, sorry.
Okay, super.
There you go.
So, what is integral consciousness? Why are we here? Why did we decide to spend our weekend in the basement of this building rather than in the warm fall air of the most vibrant and beautiful city in the world? I'm going to look at this in a kind of inside-out way. And what I mean by that should become apparent as we move along. But essentially, if you think of the move between mental and integral as the difference between looking at a tree and looking at a picture of a tree, you have two inversions when you're taking a photograph. You have the inversion of the light that comes through the lens, which you then have to put right side up so that you can look at the picture. And you have the color to negative back to color. Both of these inversions are part of the way that the mental world makes meaning. And so we're going to be looking at integral consciousness through one of these inversions, or through two of these. So I take it to be fundamental to integral consciousness that there's an aspect, although not total, there's an aspect of awakeness in the Buddhist sense, and there's an aspect of intersubjectivity. That's what we're going to be looking at today. And the goal, hopefully, I'll be articulating a trans-symbolic meaning, an integral view, an orientation to practice and to meaning, to social practice, to life practice, to spiritual practice. And trans-symbolic here, I'm not using trans just to mean transcendent, but transparent. So you can think of it as being transparent symbolic meaning. That's ambiguous. It means at least two things at once, and so I have to mean them both. It means seeing through symbols, where symbols are referent to something else. They're referring to some kind of meaning outside of themselves, but also in the sense of seeing through. Of course, transparent means to be seeing through something. So seeing through like a light bulb, like a window pane, where you can see light through it, but also in the sense of being a source of light, which we'll touch on in a little bit. Before we get to that, I want to talk about what I take to be basically axiomatic of what mental consciousness is and what it does. And I think that the core activity of mental consciousness is something that I call reality location. I haven't quite seen this articulated in the same way somewhere else. So reality location is the activity of locating reality in fundamentally incommensurate categories of being and experience. So being is not non-being, it is a reality location. Reality is taken to exist in the category itself. Being is different than non-being. What I think is happening under the hood is actually that reality is being located in this active separation. Mental consciousness does not see it because it can't. It would be fundamentally dysregulative for mental consciousness to recognize this active component of the way that it is in the world. But nonetheless, under the hood, I think that reality is being located in the difference between these, what I'm calling overarching categories of being, of thought, of experience. Here's a whole bunch of them. We've talked about a lot of them, actually. So it's taken as axiomatic that 1 is not the same as 0, which is not the same as multiplicity or as duality. Being is not non-being, active is not passive, being is not doing, I am not you. Mind is not body, matter is not spirit, so the mind-body problem, I think, comes out of this. Agency is not communion, phenomena is not noumenon. We talked a little bit about the foundations of Western logic this morning, and I take all of these problems, quote unquote, of Western philosophy, not only phenomena and noumena, but epistemology and ontology. You cannot derive a should from an is, free will and determinism to be mental consciousness coming to terms with its own limits. There are many others up here. Some of them we've talked about. Noise is not silence from this morning. Yeah. There are other options. There are other ways of making meaning of being human, which everybody in this room knows. There are other evolutionary ways of being, where 50,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, nobody would articulate the difference between being and non-being as being a problem in some sense. The separation or difference between subject and object and how they're implicated in each other would not be a problem 50,000 years ago. Developmentally, it's not a problem for my daughter. This is a way for me to slip my 4-year-old into this talk. It would not occur to my daughter to think of the problem of what it is that we can know and what is real to be a problem. But that doesn't mean that there's anything, anything off about her. She's a perfectly happy, perfectly healthy 4-year-old. It would never occur to her to formulate things in this way. That's a perfectly valid and skillful way of human being. And the basic point here that we're working with is that mind develops. And mind develops in participation with the objects of the world that appear to us at this scale. So we learn certain things about what is real by participating with these objects. And one of these fundamental rules that we learn is that two objects that are different cannot occupy the same space. We port these into our more abstract concepts as our mind develops. So as we start to develop concepts of justice, which again I don't think is an accident, we were talking about that earlier today, we we take these truths that we've learned in interaction with the material world into these abstract concepts and objects of thought. And as we get even more abstract and we reach these sort of overarching abstractions like being or like doing or like absence and presence, we take those rules and orient to these objects in the same basic way. Being cannot be non-being. This is something that's always embodied. As abstract as we get, it's never different or separate from our participation with the world around us, not just in an objective sense, but with each other as social beings. Notice we're not talking about something that is true, or actually somebody, I think it was your presentation with the quote where Gebser's talking about the difference between what is right and what is true. So here we could say it's not something that is right, which is a more mentally oriented way of looking at it, but something that is experienced and so skillful. Does this help, or does this hinder my expression of being in the world, our expression of being in the world? These are not thoughts, although they can be, and they're not even assumptions. They're taken as axiomatic. They must be the case for reality to be as it is. And yet we have these paradoxes that we just can't seem to resolve, no matter how much we think about them. And some of those paradoxes we had up in the list before. Before we move on, we're all mental. And I don't think that we can emphasize that enough. We are watching the emergence of something, but we are still very much informed and constrained by the world that we are coming out of. Every single person in this room developed in a world whose basic fundamental assumptions, fundamental foundational assumptions, are mental assumptions. Gebser is not Kant. Gebser is not the full flowering of his kind of consciousness. He's more like Petrarch, somebody who saw the early buds popping out on the tree. So what? So what's an integral view? I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about non-symbolism and intersubjectivity. For non-symbolism, I'm going to be using the work of Dr. Jeffrey Martin, and then we're going to look at Dzogchen, which is the highest of the Tibetan Tantric Buddhisms, as being not exemplary of a kind of thought, but because I think it gives us some tools to work with as we're looking at how do we articulate an integral view. And these are also not exactly exemplary for Tibetan Buddhism. These are Khandro Deshen and Nyakpa Chogyam Rinpoche, and they're Westerners, they're English. And I actually think that's important. They've come up with a very practical, down-to-earth way of expressing the truths of Tibetan Buddhism to normal people, to people that we would consider to be, everyday Joes. Non-symbolic consciousness. You might also hear the term non-symbolic experience. Not exactly an experience, not something that can be experienced in time. It's also not exactly consciousness. Now, nobody really knows what we mean by this word consciousness, although we all know what we mean by this word consciousness, but still, it's really hard to get people to agree on these terms. So I just want to say at the beginning, I might use them interchangeably, but we're not talking about an experience. We're not talking about a kind of consciousness exactly. I think both of those words are artifacts of our mental way of being in the world. So what is symbolic consciousness, just to give us a grounding? Symbolic consciousness essentially is the self-referential voice. So the voice that you have running in your head that is not just a thought about something, but is orienting yourself in the story of your life. As you're navigating the world around you, this is the story that you're telling to yourself as that is happening. It's associated with a sense of underlying existential anxiety. So if you ask someone who is representative of this kind of consciousness, to look deep down within themselves and see what is the foundation upon which everything else that they are rests. There is this sense of fundamental anxiety, which the existential philosophers plumbed. And it's also associated with the default mode network neurologically. So not the task network, in which you are in flow and focused on something and doing something, but the sort of daydreaming self. So that's symbolic consciousness for the purpose of this talk. Essentially, it's the I. It's what happens when you construct self out of the embodied and referential meaning making that we associate with being just basically the way that normal people function. Ongoing non-symbolic experience and Jeffrey Martin's research. So Jeffrey Martin did the first in-depth cross-cultural study of the experience of enlightenment, awakening, unitive consciousness, whatever you want to call it. Nobody had really talked to these people to ask them what their experience was like, not cross-culturally, not cross-lineage. He had 1,200 interview participants, ran them through quantitative studies of well-being from what's it called? Positive psychology, and also long, sometimes 12, 24-hour-long interviews about what their experience was like. And at first he started with people that were what I'm calling lineage certified. So you go to a lineage and the lineage says this person is an exemplar of what it is that we're trying to do here. This person exemplifies the end of this path. But he found that actually he didn't have to do that, that most people who were expressing this or saying that they were experiencing this in some way fit into these categories that he would eventually come up with. What's important for our talk is that word ongoing. And after a year, this becomes persistent. This is not a state. It's not something that you feel, although feeling good can be associated with it. It's something that becomes the condition of your way of being in the world. There are many varieties of it. That's also important. Most lineages will point to one very specific thing and say, this is what enlightenment is. What he found is, it doesn't really work that way. And basically, all non-symbolic consciousness is the waking sense of self, clear that what it is not the named being. It's not the voice that's in your head that's telling you what's going on. It's not the name that you were given at birth. And underneath this is a sense of well-being, the very palpable, tangible self sense that everything is okay, rather than that underlying fundamental sense of anxiety. For some people, this is extremely obvious and out in the front. For some people, they have to turn around and check a little bit, but basically that's there. Not metaphysical. This is cross-cultural, cross-lineage. There are many conflicting interpretations about this. So you go to one lineage and they'll say, this is what's happening. This is the metaphysical interpretation of this. The consciousness of Christ has descended into this person. You go to another lineage and they say that's all a load of malarkey. This person has merely, transcended their limited sense of self, whatever it is. But it is a very real, very attainable human experience. Everybody in this room can experience this, and not after sitting in a cave for 20 years. So another part of his research that we're not going to be talking about, or that I'm not going to touch on, was essentially coming up with a protocol to help get people to access and to experience this. Another fascinating side of the research. Dzogchen. We're going to talk about a couple of different things that are features of the discourse in Dzogchen, the practices in Dzogchen, that I think are important for what it is I'm trying to point out with this talk. So first of all, Rigpa, which is the Tibetan term for awakeness, awakened consciousness, and the way that they orient to non-duality. There's this word view, which I've mentioned a couple times. We'll get a little bit more into that. There's the relationship to time, to linear time, And then there is their way of working with concepts, which I consider to be trans-symbolic. We're not going to get into dream yoga and guru yoga. Unfortunately, it would be awesome. I cut it out because of the time, but if you want to talk about it afterwards, I would love to. So Rigpa is not asymbolic. So many lineages of meditation will say what you're looking for is the consciousness that exists without symbols, without interpretation. In this metaphor of the movie theater and the screen, what a lot of meditation lineages will say is you're looking for the screen. The screen exists, and if there's fire on the screen is not burnt by that fire. It is not affected by that fire. You're looking for that non-symbolic or asymbolic awareness that's underneath your experience of life. The Tibetans say, well, that's good, but that's really just the start. Because if you're taking this awareness as being foundational for all experiences, then it cannot be separate from what we consider to be concepts and what we consider to be thought. Thought is appearing on this screen, just as everything else is, which means it also cannot be different from it. And so in the Tibetan metaphor, and I've actually never heard a Tibetan teacher refer to it this way, but essentially the light that is appearing as images on the screen or the capacity for those images to show up and the audience are all the same thing. And that is taken to be awakeness. That is taken to be what Rigpa is. Self-knowing, self-experiencing. Again, consciousness, not exactly the right word. This is not an experience, the basis of all experience. And it shines through, or shines as all experience. It is accessible through all experiences. View is something like an orientation to take to life. And I'll give an example of a view in a second, and we'll hopefully click the following couple things I'm going to say into place. But first, get a sense of it. View is not an intellectual understanding, although it can be expressed in symbols, it can be in language. View is not an experience, and it is also not merely a thought. View is rather a way of orienting to all experience that can elicit certain desired experiences. And we have this very strange articulation, which actually will be a little, I think, less strange from this morning's, from your talk this morning. We might have a sense of this, but it's very important, and you will hear this over and over again. View, path, and fruition, or the orientation that you take to practice. The practice itself and the fruit, the hoped-for fruit of that practice are not different from each other. They are only separable as a way of talking about experiences in linear time. Another way of saying that is that view, meditation, and action, or the orientation that you take to meditation, the meditation itself, and the skillful action that is the outpouring of awakened consciousness are all the same thing. That is a very unfamiliar way of thinking about process in a Western context. So the first view that I was exposed to is this experience right now is an expression of Buddha nature. It has to be. There's no other options. This is introduced after practices that help to deconstruct the conventional sense of self. So you have a sense already of this non-conceptual awareness, the movie screen that exists beyond or behind your experience. But then you can't do anything else to bring this about, because it's already there, it's already the foundation of your experience. And when you take a view like this, three different things can happen. You can have a neutral experience, you can just be sitting there, or you can have an experience that confirms the view, that allows you to see or recognize the truth of the view and relax into it a deeper level of your being. Excuse me. Or you can kind of reject it. You can have an experience that's really difficult, that is really full of suffering, and say, you know, this is definitely not Buddha mind. No, definitely not. And the practice at that point is just to say, okay, sure, all right, I will look at this as being Buddha mind, even this, okay, even this experience here, which I don't want, this is Buddha mind too. Origin is ever present, I actually think, is an example of a view that we would all be familiar with. So, I just touched in on this briefly. I keep saying this part and noticing how Rigpa, or enlightenment, is not an experience. It's not something to be had in time. It's not something that can happen in time. It's something that is the basis of your experience at this moment. It is your experience right now. If you're trying, right, and in the discourse of many meditation lineages, you are sitting to achieve something. You're sitting to achieve enlightenment. That's a kind of view. And from the Tibetan perspective, they would say, you're going to confirm that view. So if you're sitting and trying to find enlightenment, you are confirming the view that enlightenment is somewhere in the future. And that will always be the case because you're always practicing in this moment. Time, as a mental construct, is the product of projecting states of experience elsewhere. So I think they figured out something really basic about the way that we organize ourselves mentally. You take an experience and you project it into the future, or you project it into the past, or you project it into other people, or you project it into conditions, and that's the way that we kind of create the space within which we get to experience more than just this passing moment. View brings an atemporal orientation to this moment in linear time, which evokes a different kind or category of experience and helps to deconstruct the basis for linear time as a mental construct and other mental reality constructions. The relationship to concepts that the Tibetans have, view is not a metaphysical truth. This is not something that is true about reality, period. This is a way of articulating what reality is. It's a skillful articulation that helps to deconstruct your implicit or mental view of the world and helps you to be a different way. But it's not something that is true in an abstract sense. Concepts are not opposed to non-conceptual awareness. We touched on that a little bit. Ooh, I'm behind. So there's a flip here too. I think that awakeness is a basic constituent of integral consciousness, or awakeness in the Buddhist sense is a basic constituent of integral consciousness, but that's coming at it backwards. It would be better to say that awakeness is what happens when you strip off or make transparent many of the different structures that compose our mental way of meaning making. Intersubjective practices, second part of the talk, third part, fourth part. I'm not sure. So I'm going to skip through this a little bit. Basically, I did a 3-year research project for my master's degree on what are called intersubjective awareness practices. So basically, any practice where you're sitting with other people and the focus of the meditation, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, is the space between, or the relationship, the way that the relationship is being constructed. Skip. Okay. And a couple really important things happen in intersubjective awareness practices that are pretty common. So the first one is that you start to notice that the way that you make meaning as a being around what is real and what is true is actually socially regulative. It's not just something that is true. So this example here that I have, disconnection, this is something that you see a lot, that comes up all the time. People are sitting in the group and they feel disconnected from the group. The first interpretation is to say, I am disconnected from this group. Then you recognize, oh, wait a minute, okay, that's a feeling. That's actually something that's a way of me interpreting my experience right now. That can move, doesn't always, and I don't think everyone would put it the way that I am, but that can move into the recognition that that interpretation is fundamentally reality organizing. And the way that you do that conditions the way that you're able to be with people. So you go from disconnection is just a fact to disconnection is this feeling, it's something that I'm kind of doing, I'm active in, to recognizing how deep that action goes, and that the interpretation, before you're conscious of it, before you're aware of it, before you're able to see it as being a mental object, is something that is conditioning how and what you are in the world. And the good news is that these practices also help you to liberate that. So if you're walking around in this particular shape all the time, and you start to do this, you notice, oh, I can do some different things with myself than I normally take to be possible. So again, early fruit, you start to notice that the way that I code, the way that I cognize, the way that I regulate or interpret experience starts way before I am aware of it. It happens way before I am conscious or I can locate it as being an object of thought. And nonetheless, and kind of paradoxically, it is an activity. It's something I'm doing, and it's something that I can take greater responsibility for, even if I'm not aware of it or before I'm aware of it. This leads to both a greater interpersonal depth, a greater sense of connection and of coming out of relationship rather than having a relationship. But it also leads to a greater sense of individuation. Your own boundaries can become clearer. Your own sense of who it is that you are as a being can become clearer. This moves on. If you keep doing these practices, you start to notice, holy shit, life is inside me and it's outside of me. Subjectivity is inside of me and it's outside of me. I can meet subjectivity in another person. Life force, what is most deep or most true about my being, is not inside my being, but in both places at the same time. Again, this is a lived experience. This is not a thought that you have. It's something that you see. It's something that you can start to organize your own life and experience around. This continues to develop and deepen to the point where I call this multiple or overlapping infinities. So there's a practice that I do with people that gets them into touch with the sense of what I am is essentially infinite. But what you are is also essentially infinite. And what we are is also infinite. These are not conflicting. They exist simultaneously. They're all present. They're all happening at the same time. This is also a view. This is not a metaphysics. I, we, you. These are all available, and they're potentially skillful articulations. And I don't mean that just in the verbal sense, like I'm saying I feel this at the moment, but you get to draw upon that possibility in the construction of yourself. And there's another flip here. This is something that's already underneath your experience of being a separate I, not in a systems sense, or in a psychologically constructive sense, or even in the attachment theory sense, right? We've known for a long time, it's been standard in psychology that who I am when I develop is not just some separate being, but that always happens in relationship, particularly in relationship with our early caregivers. The closest articulation that I've seen to this is from a guy named Dan Siegel, who says, mind, what the hell is mind? Mind is not the brain, it's the brain and the body. Mind is in the brain and out of the brain. Mind is inside of me, but it's also inside of you. Mind is inside of me, and it's inside of the world. And so I see that as being a way of trying to articulate a concept that is, in a sense, trans-symbolic. It's also not, and I think people get stuck on this, at least in the world that I come from, mental consciousness is not being an I, and integral consciousness is then being a we. I and we, or particular ways of constructing I and we, are available to mental consciousness. And then the ability to use those creatively, I think, is emblematic of integral consciousness. You get to use those interpretations as the medium of creative participation, as this universal field of happening. That's also a metaphor that I don't always like, but I can't find a better way of saying it at the moment. So trans-symbolic meaning. Embodied referential meaning making, what we normally think of as being meaning, is encompassed by expressive and participatory performance. So the Buddha pointing at the moon, where you might have heard the Zen phrase, like Zen is just a finger pointing at the moon. That pointing is referential. The moon is the referent, but the Buddha is the moon. The Buddha is the moon pointing at itself. I think this allows for a much more fluid and free cognition and use of symbols that is nonetheless not chaotic. It isn't a devolution into a place where we can't find meaning or make any meaning, because all of this is lit up, it's organized around something more present and more enduring than any concept could hope to refer to or to contain. And in your talk, you also mentioned integral doesn't mean unity. Doesn't even mean reintegration. It's a kind of differentiation within a single identity at the same time. Hard to express that. So all of this talk has been to lead up to this articulation, this essay. that I, what I am, what we are, what you are, is the universe. That universe's key feature is generativity, or abundant creativity, and that the symbols that we use are creative, skillful expressions and realizations of this creativity happening as our lives, or as our life. Or said more simply, this is generativity. This is everything. This is yourself. We, as the universe, we, as integral consciousness, are realizing this directly, in both senses of realization. We are recognizing that that is the case, and we are making it so through the articulation of our being. We are making it real. This is also a view. This is not metaphysically true. This is not an intellectual exercise. And it's not something that we can realize in the future. It is something that needs to be realized now and can be realized now. In the same way that I am human is a kind of view that was not available 50,000 years ago. Nobody would have articulated I am a human being in quite the same way as we do today, to mean that cross-culturally I am the species Homo sapien. I am not the mind. I'm also not the body mind. I'm everything. I'm everything that is happening. Everything that has ever happened. Everything that will ever happen. Skip that. Why does this matter? I think this is really simple. It becomes complex because of the ways in which we are basically unable to decouple our identity, the ways that we are being in the world, from reality locations, from very basic things, like I am not me, or I am not the world around me. The complexity lies in untangling the way that we make meaning as minds. It's also not something that's highfalutin. So awakeness or non-symbolic consciousness is wonderful. But this word, awakeness, is a massive word. Intersubjectivity is this big, complex thing. It's so much more simple than that. Why does it matter? Because we need to practice this. Not as a thing that we do in a space for a certain period of time, but in the way that everything that you're doing is in some sense a practice. You are deepening the grooves of your being in every moment. If we're going to be integral, if we're going to bring integral consciousness out and onto the world, if we're going to embody it and emanate it, then we need to be practicing that. And I take these to be two fundamental ways of practicing integral consciousness. So the question I have is, what is the practice? What is the activity of integral consciousness that integral is and does in every moment? Whatever that is, that could be said to be an integral view. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes for questions. Maybe 3 or 4. Or comments.
Hey, Andrew, I got a really great sense or feeling when you were talking about the practical sort of implications of what time is for us, like how we use it. And I really enjoyed your description of that because I just felt it like opening up the space for like that time freedom. I thought that was a really like concise way of sort of explaining that, sort of like how our relationship to time, there is freedom in there once you see what its purpose is. And I don't feel like a lot of people, I think people kind of like over romanticize the timeless, as if it doesn't exist. They don't understand the actual like tool that it is for consciousness and the role that it plays. So I really enjoyed that piece and the whole presentation.
feel like I really want to say something, but nothing is quite coagulating yet. But this is just an aside. When we think of ourselves as humans now, and we can, give ourselves the Latin form of sapiens sapiens, an interesting phenomenon in some native languages, definitely not all, is that what they call themselves translates just simply as the people.
The people, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is very different than humans, like those people,
Right.
Right,
Yeah.
where you have the Greeks and the barbarians. Everyone who is not a Greek is some other thing. They're fundamentally different than what we are.
Well,
They weren't wrong. Just making sure.
yeah. and the people, are just separate from like the beavers and the elk, and yet in some cultures, the beavers and the elk are in some sense people too.
People as well, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the flexibility that comes from what I'm trying to articulate is to say, like, of course beavers are not people, like they're different, and of course, like an American is different than than someone who is a Swede, right? And our discomfort with recognizing that that's something that we're doing, that's a way of being creative about what reality is I think what I'm talking about. We don't need to be uncomfortable about that. Of course beavers are different from what people are. And of course I'm different from you. I'm fundamentally different, separate, we have different mind streams in the Buddhist sense. But that doesn't mean that, or I should say, like, that sense of there being a reality in that difference as being different than what non-difference is that was not a very well said way of putting it, but that's the thing that I think mental consciousness does without recognizing it, and that we become really uncomfortable when we start to question, saying, like, not being able to know what reality is and what is illusion or what is real and what is non-real. Those are the criteria of what sanity is. So you can get thrown into a mental hospital for questioning those things in a particular way. But I'm not saying that there's a gigantic red dragon that's floating in this room and breathing fire on all of us. We can tell that that's a different kind of thing than to say that that because we can never refer in a complete or total way to these, what I'm calling here, overarching categories of being, that it therefore means that they're meaningless. No, of course they're not meaningless. They're very important, but they're not metaphysically true. They're socially true. They're skillfully true. They're ways that we have of helping to lubricate the flow of our being and our becoming.
So I was just going to say, first of all, thank you for noticing the dragon. I feel much better now. I thought it was just me. And there are two things that come to mind from your interaction right now and your presentation. And one is the idea that a lot of the conversations that we have in here this year and every year would be considered pretty out there in a lot of other rooms. Right? So Gebserian thought would be a dragon in certain rooms.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we have to recognize that experience equals knowledge equals context. I would also say, and I would point you to something that I'm sure you know, I don't need to be pedantic about it, but the Hindu concept of Beda Abheda, that things are different and non-different at the same time. And that that's a very helpful, I think that's a very helpful construct here. Because we get hung up on the thing, is it different, is it the same? And the answer is yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I just thought I would throw that out there.
And I think that's helpful to untangle the knots that we get that we get ourselves into. But in whatever an integral world would be, we wouldn't even need to say that to each other because it would be so fucking obvious. That's the beginning point. That's not the conclusion.
Well, that's kind of summed up in saying attributed to hypersymbolically, that my view is as vast as the sky, but my action is as fine as the
Yes.
sand.
Yeah, totally.
And in the endlessly generative, endlessly creative play of consciousness, we can accept those differences as real, not real, and then, as it were, play with them, allow ourselves to become the playing of
Yeah, to become the playing of them, not in the realm of abstraction, but using the realm of abstraction through what it is that we are doing as beings. And not as an articulation of those abstractions, but as, you know, I had this little teeny thing, but like, you know, the recognition that what I am is not necessarily knowable in an explicit way by my mind is a really freaky realization for a lot of people, that there are processes in your body that you're coming out of that you're not in control of. It is a mind fuck for a lot of people. What I think we're talking about in this room is that it's equally true to say you're not even those processes of your body. You're the processes of the entire fucking universe as it's happening right now. And there's that same kind of line between those things. It's much easier to say, okay, yeah, but there's something about me here in this body than it is to say, you know, it's equally as important, or I am equally as identified with the entire process of everything happening in this planet, or universe, or multiverse.
I love when you get really animated and excited, because I feel like you're really speaking from your heart, and kind of brings it all together when you do that. It's so nice.
Yeah, I really like your hand gesture. I've been smiling this whole time.
I really, that's a beautiful metaphor about the blank screen, the light, and the audience. And we are all of that.
Yeah.
That's a basic realization. But then what happens next is what interests me.
Yeah, me too.
And I think we're in this mental deficient phase, as you know, we're all there. We've come out of that, and that's what we are. But we're all trying to use our imaginations to fill in some of these gaps. And as you're talking, I was just thinking about multiple personality syndrome. It's a pathological category that we use, I believe, in this mental deficient phase. Mm-hmm. And our American psychiatry basically is pathologizing just about everybody all the time that they can. Yeah. If you look at the diagnostic statistical manual, we all should be lying.
Yeah, we're all in there.
But I'm wondering if there's a healthy and efficient multiple personality, which would no longer be a syndrome. And I believe that if we're talking about vision, aesthetic relationships, that capacity for vision which we all have, depending on how we've been recognized, or if it's been failed, or if we've had a lot of suppression or repression, it comes out in strange kind of ways. So I'm just interested in that. I'm just interested in the imaginal as an objective realm that is shareable. Yeah. I think some films in popular culture, like films like Inception, things like that, I think have tracked that in a pathological way. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's the only way our culture probably, because and I think there's a danger as a mental deficient person that I am, trying to operationalize the paranormal. I'm not so much interested in the transparent self as I am the para-self. There are parallel realms that you can enter into. They all have that background of the light of awareness, the blank screen audience. But there are, it's not just, the entities that I'm meeting are not just figments of my imagination. They can talk back. Yeah. And they have language too. Yeah. And we have to find a language. They don't always speak English. I ask them to speak English so that I can remember and bring it back. Yeah. These are big challenges, very big challenges. Because, you know, these capacities are very marginalized. Yeah, but they're very real and they're very potent. Very real. Yeah. But a lot of people tell you it isn't real. Yeah, so it's just your imagination. Yeah. And relax around those people, and you find there's openings for articulating something that's, you know, from these para worlds. Yeah. And I think we're working on that here. I can feel a lot of us maybe isolated in some ways but we're trying to find a common language that is probably core experiences all of us have.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much. I wish we had time to get into the dream yoga.
Yeah, oh, it's so fascinating. Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is the one thing I would say, there's so much in your comment, it's so rich. I think, and this is just opening up to me, but the metaphor that I've been feeling and sort of been using in the last 6 months is not that these are places that we really go to, but and that there is actually, if you, the work of Varela and Thompson and like, neurologically we're finding out that there are all of these different sub neuro centers, and essentially one thing that happens with a long period of meditation is that you're no longer filling the middle room with something that is the central enduring self, but you're able to draw on all of these different side rooms, and the metaphor that has been occurring to me recently is like, I don't actually need to go into one of those side rooms. I don't need to go into a trance to then have that experience and then come back to this central room. I can keep all of these doors open and draw upon the information that's available there at will. And even to call it information is kind of is I think an over-mentalization of it. It's more like a kind of creative mode of being. And I think when you bring up a multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder, which I'm very familiar with for historical reasons, but there is something to that being that being pathological, that being not a skillful way of being, not something that the person is in control of. But it doesn't mean that it's then this, that the capacities that are being evinced in multiple personalities or in dissociative identity disorder are not something that you can have control of and that you can bring into the fullness of your being. Even this word control is not a good word because that kind of connotes mastery over. But when I say it, I mean more like a dancer has control of their body, or an athlete has control of the way that they articulate themselves and try to make something happen in a game.
Well, what you were suggesting to me in your movement was like a mandala. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's like I can go into the periphery of the mandala, or I can enter into the center. Mm-hmm. I can step back and let other members of the mandala perform. Yeah. So for me, it's a theater space. It's a rehearsal space. I can play all these roles. Yeah. But then I come back into I make a distinction between the physical, social world, where all of us are
this place.
And the imaginal. Yeah. And which is a sort of my own little theater company.
And that's the rabbit hole of dream yoga.
I assume everyone else has a little theater ensemble they're working with too. Yeah. And you might be in a relationship with anyone, you start to see that really. Yeah. And then multiple personalities can come through. So anyway, that's a helpful metaphor too, along with all these other metaphors we've been playing with, like the Moby strip and
they're all metaphors. They're none of them are pointing to what is finally real, because that thing that is finally real is not finally locatable in this way. And that's the recognition that is deeply uncomfortable for a mental being in the world. We're trying to find the thing that is real, because then we can know how to operate it. And like you said, it's operationable in that way. We can make life better, but the way that we make life better is not by finding that thing and then building everything on top of it. It's letting go of the entire idea that is findable, and then just allowing the amazing creative flow of the universe to take over. That would be one way of saying it. I don't particularly like this one that came out.
There's still an I present. The I is still present, as it were, as the director of the theater ensemble.
Absolutely.
And yet the paradox is that the I is the higher I, as it were, is simply capable of having the awareness of the multiplicity and not losing itself in the process of not being able to perceive the multiplicity, or seeing the multiplicity as outside.
And that's like one way of experiencing everything that we're talking about, but there are other ways that are also equally as true and equally as valid expressions of a way of not resolving a paradox, but of dissolving the foundation that the paradox is built on. So you can have people who walk around with no experience of an I. There is no center of meaning making. It's just all happening. They are that happening. There's no separation or difference there. Or you can say, this is all I. This is all self. This is all capital S self. They're both things that happen. They're like things that happen as people. And that's, I mean, one of the things that I find Dr. Martin's work so valuable for is validating all of that and not saying any of these one things is the real deal. It is the one thing that, you know, you really want to go to or experience. People want to experience different things for different reasons. Where does that motivation come from? That question in itself is a kind of mental question. The motivation is the expression of the activity. It's not separable from it, not in any fundamentally real way.
I just, your talk was just so rich, and I just feel like there's so many ideas there, but something in this conversation, but I want to try to articulate, but which had never occurred to me before, that I really liked was this kind of the dichotomies of the mental consciousness, and even the fact of then trying the mental consciousness going in there and trying to get away from the dichotomies by saying, you know, by having to like back think them the other direction. And it's like both of those things, whether you're in the dichotomy or you're trying not to do the dichotomy, you're still in the dichotomy.
You're still caught in, yep.
Right, and so like that possibility that, you know, becomes possible, or of what integral consciousness is, where it's like organically that doesn't even exist.
Yeah.
That's not like you're past that construct and you're into a whole other place.
Yeah.
When that thing doesn't have to be going on, then something very different is possible, which we don't really even know yet because we haven't gotten past that. And so it's sort of like the practice then, you know, because you left with this big question, like, what's the practice, right? And so it seems like the practice is some way of, I mean, maybe you do have to come back to this place where you're just like constantly reminding yourself of the complementariness or the sameness of it. I mean, just like you said, you can't go, like if you're going into an altered state and then coming back, that too is that dichotomy.
Yes, yeah.
It's like it's either this or it's that.
That's an experience.
It's an experience in time of that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, that's so I like, it makes me feel very excited.
What I think is possible, what I think happens is not that you don't do that anymore, but you recognize that the way that you do that is a creative option that's open to you in any moment. So you can be, you know, any of a number of different selves. You've got selves. You can imagine any number of different selves and have them be real and effectual in the world for what it is that you need them to be doing. So not that there's just a little bit different, but like, there's this developmental level in Susan Freud's work called construct aware, and what happens in construct aware is that you start to notice that basically any mental object is something that you're just making up or that you're doing. There's a way out of that. The way out of it is not to stop making mental constructs. It's just to notice that they're kind of happening anyway, and not to be attached to them, or trying to grab onto them, or trying to fix them as something solid. Or just they're doing their job. You can rely on them. You can trust that will happen, and you can just kind of, you can be in them or not be in them, or defend them or not defend them, or, you know, it's radically more creative than we can, you know, even, like the metaphor that I love is, you're building, like if you go to any building here, right, there are these different, any construction site, there are these different phases of construction where you first cordon the construction site off from the outside world, and then you build scaffolding, you do. But at a certain time, all of that superstructure that helps you to put it together comes down, and then the building just becomes a part of the living flow of life of the city. It becomes integrated into, and as the city, it is the city in this particular location. There's more there. I'm feeling Jeremy's articulation of the presidency.
Mental structure and time. Thank you. Okay, we're going to move right into Dave Zuckerman's talk, Nationalism and the Politics of Transparency. Get that set up right here. Get some light on.
Dave, what was that gender concept you mentioned?
Beta Abheda. It's beta dash Abheda. Yeah, I would like for us to have the light on. because I'm boring. You'll fall asleep. We need some light. Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
It might ask you to, it might give you that code to let you go in through.
Oh, on the phone?
Yeah. on the
Okay,
phone.
I have my phone right here. So.
It might just be off to people.
It's happened.
Trust this browser.
Don't trust anything.
If only life were that easy, right?
Don't trust anything that comes from me.
Trust this nice man on the subway.
I had a guy on the subway last night who was like, all I have is my honesty. I'm not going to lie to you. I want to buy weed tonight. I really want to get high. Can I please have some money for getting high?
How much did you give him?
I didn't give him anything, but this was a really practiced speech. Yeah, he was fluent in it. It's successful. Like, he's gotten money this way, which is more power to him.
Hey, look at that. Okay.
And then just like it, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Jesse.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. So we'll see if everybody can see, or if we need to maybe turn off this bank of lights, whatever this is. Might want to turn off, if we can turn off just this one, if that's possible.
Those ones turn on. That one turns on. Those ones.
It's all-
All right, well, we'll wing it if it's, because there are some pictures up front. So what we might want to do is turn them off until I get to the words. Okay, so, hi there. I know most of you at this point, but for those of you who I'm just meeting for the first time, I'm a professor of communication studies in Sacramento, former president of the Gebser Society, and why that matters is because today's paper, while it's a standalone thing, really isn't. It's part of a larger work that I've been doing over the years at Gebser conferences. So my particular area of expertise is terrorism and the dark side of life. And so in the past, I've presented papers about a way to use Gebser to bring peace and reconciliation to Afghanistan. Not last year, 2 years ago, my paper was about Chinese nationalism. And this continues in that vein. So for those of you familiar with my earlier works, this will make more sense than if it's just a standalone piece. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, I apologize, but I encourage you to check it out on the Gebser website because we've recorded these for years. And so several of them are actually up there. So, so I want to start by taking us to China. We've talked a lot about China yesterday and today, so this is a theme for a lot of us as well. So this is a map, and it's not super easy to read, I realize. It's a map of the holiest of the 5 sacred mountains of China. That mountain is called Mount Tai, or Taishan. It's in the Shandong province, just southwest of Beijing. And there are 5 sacred mountains of Taoism, of ancient China. And Taishan is the tallest of the 5. And it is a pilgrimage site for Chinese people, even Chinese people who aren't so into Taoism. And I'll talk about why in a minute. So this is a hand-drawn map that's on the website of the Antiquities and Parks Ministry, or whatever it is who administers these. But what I want you to notice is that there are various way stations from the bottom to the top of the mountain. Now that you've seen that there are things to see there, let me show you an actual photograph of this place. And it looks like this. So it's just shy of 7,000 stairs to get from the bottom to the top of this mountain. And the stairs are reminiscent of the stairs at the Anne Frank house, if you've been to the Anne Frank house. Real tall, raised stairs. And And they call them in Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, they call them knee breaker stairs. They don't call them that in China, but they ought to, because it is an ordeal to climb this mountain. And the tradition in Taoism is to start at nighttime and to climb through the night so that you are there for the sunrise, which I did. And it's odd, it was 80 degrees out at night, and we had to rent these big, heavy army coats. And I'm like, it's 80 degrees, why am I renting this coat? And you buy these canes for 20 cents. And I thought, this is stupid, why am I doing this? Everyone's doing it, and I thought, maybe there's a reason. So I rent this coat and I buy this cane, and I was glad for both, because at the top of the mountain it's not 80 degrees, and you need this cane because this mountain teaches you how old you actually are. And, this is where you say to yourself, I am no longer 20, and I need a cable car down, because I climbed all 7,000 of these steps. Now, along the way, and this goes back to what we talked about with you, Jesse, and with Brant's piece yesterday, there are way stations, and there are things with writing on them. And each of the gates has meaning, each of the places has meaning, and so you'll see this written in Chinese characters, tells you the name of the gate or the name of the person associated with that particular location on the mountain. There are lots of Taoist and Buddhist writings, and I like this picture, which I stole from the internet, because it tells you, with this human being here, what the scale is of these. And these are all along the way up the mountain. And so you see this. And a couple things that I want you to notice is the sheer volume of the writing. So, okay, these are characters, we can see that, and these are characters, but so are each of these little dots. And so are each of these yellow dots. Each of these is a character. So this is Taoist and Buddhist writings that you see all along this pathway up the mountain. And for contemporary Chinese people, it becomes almost a tourist attraction. And you see these young girls posing, taking pictures by this rock, right? Because technically China is an atheist country, and so the Buddhist and Taoist writings are part of their heritage, but not necessarily something that drives them spiritually, right? That's at least officially. Then you get to this one. Now this one is very interesting. This one is different from the others. Can anyone tell me why?
Contemporary.
Because this scroll, if you live in China for any length of time, and you said you lived in China, so you've seen this scroll, because this scroll is everywhere. It's on posters, it's in classrooms. This particular scroll, which many Chinese people will tell you after 3 or 4 glasses of baijiu that they can't even read, this is the handwriting of Mao. Mao was a prolific writer, among other things, and had terrible penmanship. And so this one is actually legible, unlike others, and it basically says, enjoy the journey. But it's interesting because they preserve it in Mao's handwriting. Obviously, Mao did not come to Taishan with a can of paint or a big brush and do the calligraphy on the mountain. He wrote that on a piece of paper, and they transfer this. And this is where I want to start. This is where I want us to start our journey, because something important just happened on our climb up this mountain. What was a spiritual site, which had been a spiritual site for thousands of years, has sort of invisibly become a political site. Right? We went from this or this to this. And lest you think it's just Mao wishing you a nice journey, a little bit up the road, which looks like this, and by the way, did you climb Taishan when you lived in China?
I never climbed Taishan. I was at, what is it, Xiang?
Yeah.
Xiangshan.
Yeah. Taishan is one of those where when you say to Chinese people you climb Taishan, it's sort of like if a foreign visitor to America said, I just went from the Statue of Liberty to Mount Rushmore, and saw all these sites that define us as who we are. It's a special thing. And when you say you climb Taishan, they respect that, and in part because they know how painful it is. You get to the staircase and you look to the top and you think, oh, thank the Lord, I'm almost there. You get to the top and there's another staircase, and there's another staircase. You know, I think that maybe Dante wrote about this. I'm not sure. But people interact with these writings. But there's Mao again. Now this one is a very interesting writing because this one is from a poem. And this one really makes it unmistakable that it's not about the mountain. So I'm going to read you the actual poem that the entire poem is written there. So the poem says, "Of the trying long march, the Red Army makes light. Thousands of rivers and mountains are barriers slight. The 5 serpentine ridges outspread like rippling rills. The pompous Wumung peaks tower, but like molehills. Against warm cloudy cliffs beat waves of golden sand. With cold iron chain bridge river Dadu is spanned. Glad to see the Min Range snow-clad for miles and miles. Our warriors who have crossed it break into broad smiles." Mao was so talented, he could rhyme his Chinese poem in English. But, you know, what's important for us to understand about this is that the Min Range is on the other side of the country from this. This is on eastern China. The Min Range is in Sichuan. The Min Range is in the middle of the country. So this poem, bless you, this poem about the Long March of the Red Army, which is a really important part of Chinese Communist Party history, took place not only not on this mountain, but in a completely different part of the country. But it's about mountains, and we can fit Chairman Mao's poem into this climb, I suppose. Now I want you to think about that for a moment, about what happens when we replace this with this. And I say replace, even though they're both there, and you could say, well, come on, it's alongside. I'm going to make an argument that it's not alongside, it's a replacement. Because this, pardon the pun, trumps this. So I want to talk with you about nationalism. And I have to say, I love Glenn, and I'm sorry he left, because I need him here. He's my counterpart with optimism, because I am not optimistic. I'm not. It's a very difficult time to be a Gebserian, in my perspective, because it's really hard for us to talk about mutations toward integrality and aperspectivalism when we live in these times. And it's wonderful to be here and talk with each other and have these encounters that we do and everything, but in the larger world, things are tough. It's tough times. Nationalist parties have made significant gains in France with the Front National, and in Germany, the AfD party just had big gains, which has frightened a lot of Germans, and of course, frightened Germans is why they had big gains, so it's kind of a vicious cycle. In Greece, I didn't list Austria, it's another one. Nationalist governments, the nationalist parties do not run the governments in France, Germany, and Greece yet, but they do run the governments in Turkey and in China and in Russia. And nationalist politics have made gains in the United States, we all know it, we're living it, in the UK with Brexit, and in Japan. Shinzo Abe is an incredibly nationalist leader. And we have to recognize that something is happening. And if you want to call it a regressive mutation, or the surfacing of deficient magical thought, deficient mythic thought, but nationalism is happening. It's happening around us, and it's happening here. And we have to be reasonable, we have to be realistic. When it happened in Germany, Gebser left. I mean, that's a difficult position for me to be in, because I'm going to end this talk today, unless I talk too much and run out of time before I get to it, which is a strategy. I'm going to talk about what do we do about this. And I have to remind myself, maybe I go to Spain and hang out with Picasso, because that's what Gebser did. So let's start with a definition. This is from Merriam-Webster. So Merriam-Webster has a whole webpage about the difference between nationalism and patriotism. And so this is their blurb. I'm just going to start with this. We define patriotism as love or devotion to one's country, and nationalism in part as loyalty and devotion to a nation. But the definition of nationalism also includes exalting one nation above all others and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests as opposed to those of other nations or supranational groups. This exclusionary aspect is not shared by patriotism. So both nationalists and patriots are patriotic, but what makes a nationalist different from a patriot is that patriotism extends to a sense that we're more important than you are. And we're more important than any concept of a family of nations. Now, let's look at what it looks like in real life. This is from Donald Trump's inauguration speech. From this day forward, it's going to be only America for... I tried, by the way, to get Alec Baldwin in here to do this for me. He said no. He's probably in the city right now. It wouldn't have been much of a stretch. It's going to be America first, America first. Every decision on trade, on taxes, on immigration, on foreign affairs will be made to benefit American workers and American families. We must protect our borders from the ravages of other countries, making our product, stealing our companies, and destroying our jobs. So that's what nationalism looks like. Right there. America first. So important he says it twice. Now, other presidents have said America first. Other presidents, certainly every president, every prime minister tries to put their country first. That's not extraordinary. But going on, that there's no discussion about interdependence or a community of nations or allies or even the pragmatic conversation of what happens when we divest from another part of the world. What is the consequence on our country when that happens? It's as though it's not just America first, but America only. Right? That's an important thing. But it's not just Trump. So here's Erdogan of Turkey last year, April of last year. The European Union needs Turkey more than Turkey needs the European Union. Same idea. There's no supranational interdependence. It's just, you need us more than we need you. Which is an interesting thing to say when you're the leader of a country that borders Syria. But who am I? And then this is Frauke Petry. This is the chair of the AfD party, the Alternative for Deutschland party, the ultra right-wing party. And this one, it's crude, but it sums up a lot. To be frank, she says, I don't see young Muslim men wiping the asses of old German pensioners. Now, there's a lot in this statement when you think about it. The first thing that's in this statement is that, what is she saying really about young Muslim men? They're not what? They're not German. They're not German. Before that, they're not German. Right? You can't be a young Muslim man and be a German. That's implicit in this statement, which of course, we witnessed this a few decades ago. Remember, with the stroke of a pen, you're no longer a citizen or even a person. And that, of course, is a deficient mental rational approach to life, but we've seen it, we've witnessed it. And it begins with this kind of verbal maneuvering, differentiating between Germans and non-Germans, that young Muslim men... Now, we could say that, no, I don't mean that I mean that even young Muslim German men are so selfish that they wouldn't do this, or they would, but given the rest of her rhetoric, I'm pretty sure that's not what she meant. I'm pretty sure that she's that she's differentiating between us Germans and those Muslims. So let's talk about what's happening here. So we have a lot of language that we bandy about these days, right? So we talk about fascism, or proto-fascism, or neo-fascism, or we talk about nationalism, or we talk about tribalism. Well, and how many of you have heard these words inserted into this conversation? Sure, I think we all have, right? I think that's part of the overall conversation that we're having these days. But how do we explain this in Gebserian terms? Let's take the idea of tribalism, which Gebser would likely say is deficient. Certainly many Gebserians in the tradition that I come from, which is the Algis McCunis, Eric Kramer tradition, would argue just prima facie that tribalism is deficient. It's deficient magical, because it's saying we have a group, and that group is based on blood, and that's it. That's how you get in. And that idea of being in a group that you can enter only by having that blood is, by definition, deficient magic. But let's try to contrast that deficient tribalism with the mental rational construct we have now of the modern nation state. Does tribalism really work in a modern nation state? Well, certainly it doesn't in this one, because we're not all of the same tribe. Does tribalism engender, support, allow for ethnic or racial or religious diversity? Well, generally it doesn't. Now, I think that Glenn made an argument this morning that in some Native American tribes that there was a tolerance for different types of practices. We're not so much seeing that. We certainly don't see it in the FD statement. All right? And some of the other statements that you have about there are no, when they took a vote in Switzerland about no more minarets, and maybe, does that mean no more mosques at all? And there have been these conversations throughout Europe. Does tribalism allow for linguistic plurality? Well, I want to take us back to China for a minute. There are hundreds of languages spoken in China. It's really kind of a misnomer to call them as a group Chinese, because many of them are mutually unintelligible. And sometimes that lack of intelligibility, mutual intelligibility, is just a few miles apart. People from one village, Beijing is surrounded sort of as a donut by the province called Hebei. And Hebei province is a strange province because you can go like 50 miles from one Hebei village to another, and the dialects are not intelligible to each other. Now, what's weird about Chinese, though, is when you write it down, they all understand it. So when you watch TV in China, it's all subtitled in Chinese, and you think, well, I'm watching a show in Chinese that's subtitled in Chinese. Why is that? And then you find out because the people who speak Shanxi dialect or Jiangsu dialect or whatever, they might not necessarily understand the Mandarin so well, but they can read the characters and they can play it back in the audio in their own dialect. That in the written form it's the same, but spoken it's not. So in Chinese terms, linguistic plurality is one of those things that the government has gone after. So I think it was Jesse that talked about the language reforms and the characters and simplifying the characters. This was actually a project that was started by Chiang Kai-shek. It was part of the short-lived Republic of China. It was an easy way to get an illiterate group of peasants to learn to write, to teach them a simplified Chinese. But the Chinese Communist Party took that program and put it into overdrive. And so while I was living there in 2014, they announced with no warning, literally overnight, starting tomorrow, only Mandarin will be allowed to be broadcast on TV and radio. There was no warning. And one of the really cool things, I'm sure you remember this too, if you had cable TV in China, you have channels from all over the country. And it's a country that's media rich, and it's the same size basically as the United States. So that's a lot of channels. And it was a cool thing. You turn on like Xinjiang TV and you hear their dialect, or you turn on Sichuan TV and you hear their dialect. No more. The only time you can hear non-Mandarin on Chinese TV and radio is when it's a program specifically about that language, or it's an interview from somebody and it will be dubbed into Mandarin. So even in China, there's very little room for linguistic plurality. Does tribalism allow for a variety of perspectives, a variety of opinions, a variety of approaches to life? Generally not. There's our way, our path. And so it limits those. And does it open circles or does it close circles? Now, I want you to think about this, because when we talk about tribalism, we can see that tribalism really is at odds with the product of the modern globalized nation state. And think about this city, or the city where I live, Sacramento, which was called in 2000 the most integrated city in America. That we all get along, we all live side by side, because we have this beautiful, lovely, wonderful diversity. We have this linguistic plurality. We have a variety of perspectives, of opinions, of approaches. I've heard someone say, and I can't attribute the quote, that the history of the United States, the history of the world, is that the rest of the world was saying that something is impossible, and at the same time there was somebody in America figuring out A, how to do it, and B, how to get rich from doing it. And that's what you get when your population are all the outsiders. We've all had an outsider's view because we're an outsider's nation. And so this idea of then a president like Trump trying to institute some kind of tribalism really fundamentally changes the nature of who we are. So let's talk about then why nationalism is deficient. Well, it plays on deficient magic for the reasons that I just talked about blood. It plays on a deficient mythic for reasons that Gebser enumerated better than I could. But we're seeing this now. We're seeing revisionist history. We're seeing the rewriting of the Civil War, for example. And we're seeing the stories themselves being changed to fit a present narrative, rather than the present narrative being looked at as an outcome of past events, right? We're having this conversation in my department where I've uncovered the fact that we're out of compliance with policy in one of the procedures that we've done for a long time. So the question before my department is, do we change the policy to fit our procedure, or do we change the procedure to fit the policy? Nationally, we seem to be changing the procedure to fit the policy a lot of the times. There's a narrow, rigid definition of us. And part of that deficient nationalism is narrowing that definition. So you see in the AFD party the idea that Muslim men are not, bless you, are not part of us. And you can see it in this country about who's not part of us. People who disagree with the president are not part of us, or Black Lives Matter are not part of us, or Antifa are not part of us, or whomever it is, and whoever it'll be tomorrow who's not part of us. Who we are, who us is, gets narrower and narrower and narrower. That's part of deficient nationalism everywhere. And you see it in France, you see it in Germany, you see it in Greece, on Yom Kippur, of course, why not? The neo-Nazis marched in Sweden. So, and then the other thing we see is this invocation of the mythic. And when I say mythic, I don't just mean in the Gebserian sense, I also mean in the conventional sense. That we see the trotting out not only of the Gebserian mythic, but also of myths, actual myths. The myth of creation, or the myth of our archangel, or the myth of our founding fathers, or this myth or that myth. That all of a sudden we stop dealing so much in the realm of fact, and we start dealing more in the realm of myth. And we have conversations, which I'll come to in a couple minutes, on Facebook and other social media, where we're arguing with people about the intention of the writers of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence, as though we're sitting across the table from them and we can really posit what their intention was. And so this, again, goes into this myth. The other thing that we find in deficient nationalism is a more limited range of communication. So lower level vocabulary, fewer communication modalities, and less range of the groups that have voice and are part of the dialogue. That we have a table and we seem to be taking chairs away from that table for when we all come together to talk. That there seem to be fewer chairs around that table. And these seem to be parts of deficient nationalism. And again, this isn't just happening in the United States. I'm talking about this moment in the world, this retro mutation in the world. And what does the discourse look like? Well, the leaders speak of and to a narrowly defined us. And you can see that just a couple days ago if you contrast the reaction that Trump had to the storm damage in Texas or in Florida versus his reaction to the storm damage in Puerto Rico, which I'm told is an island in a big ocean with lots of water, right? This is the same guy who routinely talks about how we will have no trouble at all fighting a war against North Korea and potentially Iran at the same time. Those, by the way, he might not realize this, are also separated from us by big bodies of water. One even bigger than the one that separates us from Puerto Rico. But this isn't because of Puerto Rico, this is because of whom he was speaking to. Right? Because though Puerto Rico is a territory, they're not us. At least they're not the us that Trump is talking to. And I think that's important to understand. The other part of this goes actually to the end of your presentation today about this exclusionary language. That language and law, exclusionary language and exclusionary law co-create. We can't really say that exclusionary language causes exclusionary law, or that exclusionary law brings about exclusionary language. They co-create. They're isomorphic. And so we see things that we never saw before, like not non-combatants, that's a term, enemy combatants as opposed to enemy soldiers. That we have to create a language in order to justify the things that we want to do to people. Now this is nothing new, and I'll talk about three people who brought this up. One was Victor Klemperer. Victor Klemperer wrote, he was a Jew who survived the Holocaust in Germany. He stayed in Germany the entire time. At first he was allowed to stay because he was a veteran, and then they just didn't catch him. And he wrote diaries. He was a philologist and a linguist. So if you have a Gebser interest, you might be interested in Klemperer's diaries also. Incidentally, one of the big ironies, his nephew played Colonel Klink in Hogan's Heroes. It's a strange world that we live in. So that was Werner Klemperer. This guy's Victor Klemperer. So Victor Klemperer's diaries were turned into a documentary, which is, in my opinion, the single most impactful Holocaust documentary you could ever watch. It's called Language Does Not Lie. There's not a single depiction of a gas chamber in there. Nobody's put into a boxcar in there. It's a narrative. It's a narration of a guy reading his diaries, talking about everyday life. And what you found in that was what Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil, that the Holocaust didn't happen immediately overnight with barking dogs and scary people. It happened very, very slowly. And there's a particular scene where he lays out keys, because it's the day that Jews aren't allowed to own keys anymore. And he lays out all his keys, and as he lays out each key, he talks about another law. You know, on this date, Jews weren't allowed to own patio furniture. On this date, Jews weren't allowed to take the bus. On this date, Jews weren't allowed to have cars. On this date, Jews weren't allowed to have pets. And he lays them out like this. And as he's doing this, he's also talking about the language, which he called the language of the Third Imperium. And he talks about the fact that they don't murder people, they liquidate them. They don't deport people, they evacuate them. These are not death camps, these are concentration camps. That they created a language to cover up what they were doing, just as they created a language to classify people to begin with. So that's Victor Klemperer. George Orwell talked about this too, of course, and I think most Westerners are familiar with George Orwell. And the other George is George Carlin. I mean, George Carlin had a whole lot of routines about this, right? He talked about the fact that the Pentagon measures nuclear radiation, something we might want to think about these days, in something they call sunshine units. And so this idea that governments create obfuscating language, and that that language and exclusionary laws co-create each other, is a really important thing to look for when we're looking to say, are we in a deficient kind of nationalist period right now? There's also the tearing down of convention. So we see taboo come, it becomes okay to be taboo, to use taboo language, to talk about taboo topics. I mean, we have a president who's on tape saying vulgar things that, can you imagine 15 or 20 years ago, anyone having a chance of being elected president after the Billy Bush tape would come out about him? About sexually assaulting women and describing it in very vulgar terms. Now, the truth is that even if he used nicer language, what he was talking about was still disgusting. But the fact that he talks about something disgusting in disgusting language, and it becomes like, just like the German politician who says wiping pensioners' asses. Again, what was taboo is no longer taboo. And what was bombastic is no longer considered to be over the top anymore. And what was vulgar doesn't seem to be vulgar anymore, both in terms of vulgar language and in terms of vulgar behaviors. Now, maybe that's because if we, in a Gebserian sense, if we look at vulgar, right, it means common. It meant common. The common folk speech. And that's one of the things that happens then, is that the nationalist says, well, you know, the hoi polloi, I mean, the rich and famous, the professors, they call this vulgar, but you and I call this real talk. We call this real speech. And so vulgar in its original meaning also works here. And the last one is that anonymity fuels interpersonal conflict. So whether you get that anonymity by wearing a red guard outfit in China or a brown shirt outfit in Germany, or you go on the internet and you have an internet handle that isn't your name, anonymity is anonymity. And people use that cover of anonymity to say and do atrocious things that they most likely would not do or say without that cover. So how do we reclaim the efficient? I didn't run out of time, so I have to try to talk about this. This is hard. You know, you have a few choices. One of them is go to Spain, although Spain's not too nice right now either, right? Or if you go to Spain, you might want to avoid Catalonia. I'm not sure. But I think that it starts with us as individuals. And I'm glad that we had to rearrange the schedule so I come on right after you, because this really is about individual practice. It starts at the individual level, right? We're in a time right now where this retromutation is happening around us, and it's large. It's not just a national thing, it's an international thing. It might be a species level thing. So your sphere of influence might be very small, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist at all. And so my argument would be the first thing is examine your own language choices and your own practices. Lisa and I were talking yesterday outside of the conference that one of the things we have in common is our work, our not mutual work, but we both do it, of trying to strip the language of war and of conquest from everyday speech. There are so many metaphors, so many words that are, you know, whether we talk about battle lines or in the trenches or whole 9 yards or balls to the wall, all these that are military terms that end up in everyday speech. And it deadens us in a way. And we need to be more aware of that. And we need to be more aware of our practices, which include, to the second one, speaking to Sabrina's piece and to so many of you today and yesterday, listen. Listen more, talk less. Listen more. Listen to each other. We don't really, you know, wow, your argument about gun control on Facebook completely changed my perspective, said nobody ever. And part of it's because we don't share the same symbols, and the meanings, the words that we're using don't mean the same thing, and we're not hearing each other. And try to be grounded as you listen. Question the discourse itself. A lot of times we're expected to have an opinion about a question, but our opinion ought to be that that's a bad question. But we're forced to make a choice as though those are the only choices, or that the question itself is even legit. We need to question the discourse. And I think that goes back to your idea about being awake and about this practice. And interface with other people to provide opportunities to engage the efficient. I love coming here once a year. I do it. And I'm glad to see so many of you. I know, Jeremy, you've got something, and you've got something, and you've got something. I try to do it in my own consulting practice. But we need to stop preaching to each other about integrality, and we need to start telling them about integrality. Because, you know, Rome is burning around us. And so I think that that's where I'm going to stop. So, questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I want to make two comments. First of all, what you're saying about integrality being more integrated into the general conversation is taking place in the union community as well. There's a big discussion that's been going on for a couple of years now about cultural complexes. Tom Singer and Sam Kimmel in California are co-editors and all both. That's why they do. There's a rather significant book out now about different cultural complexes in Europe, but that's the basis of the discussion. And the other thing I want to say is about tribalism in the United States, that I think it's very important right now to listen to what Trump is saying, because Trump is, what he's doing with his rhetoric is he's trying to bring together that little tribe that supports him. This is not party politics, this is tribal politics, very much.
Yes.
And I think we were talking the other night about his discourse on Puerto Rico, for example. They are the other. And there's a certain tribe or a certain group in this country who believe that Puerto Ricans are Spanish-speaking people, they're not us. And that's what he's really directing all of his discussion toward, is creating that little tribe. And it always reminds me of the fact that at a time when there were maybe 120 million people in the entire Soviet Union, there were 10 million communists.
Right.
And they ran the whole thing.
Right. The same in China. China, Communist Party membership is by invitation, and many of the people refuse the invitation.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, I think that this goes back to the Greeks and barbarians thing. It's the same kind of thing. He's speaking to a very small group of people saying, we're the civilized ones, and the rest of those people are barbarians.
I haven't seen a copy around here of Ever-Present Origin. I wanted.
Somebody has it right there.
There is one?
To the rescue. What's your name?
There is a particular.
What's your name?
Kimberly.
Kimberly to the rescue. Thank you.
47. Anyway, I think there's hope. I mean, I think Gebser points out over and over again that there's those people who are hanging on for dear life for the old way, as we move into the new age, as we move into the age of transparency. And there's this one quote in here, something to the effect that soon there will be a potentate who people will turn to and worship. And this is not a sign of the new age. And that's quote I've often read, and I just.
Yeah, I don't know where he's going with it, but I remember reading in that book just sort of like how, during this sort of disruptive, like the transition or whatever, it's going to seem like if you're coming from it from a mental state, it's going to look like it's destructive, but it's sort of like an intensification, and he uses the word like the proximity to the deficient, right? And so for me, when I hear you speak, I actually get a migraine.
I have that effect on a lot of people.
Well, because it feels mental. It feels like, in a way, you're trying to draw attention to the deficient, but you're also giving it too much power. So from the integral, from the awareness, it's like being aware that the deficient is there, being aware that these challenges are there, being aware of the limitation of nationalism and all this stuff, being aware of Donald Trump and sort of like his unique space in our world today. But yeah, just, being aware of that, but not giving way to the fear that, the reality of our world is coming from, like the intensification and the intensity of that, but where does the real sort of transformation come from? Is holding enough space to observe all of that, including the migraine that I have, sort of like when I focus so much on the challenges, right? I don't want to ignore them, I don't want to ignore the state that I live in, but I also don't want to forget myself and my true being in that landscape and sort of like where I function as an ambassador. So it's like, I'm not going to go tell my colleagues or people that I am around, certainly not my family. I went through let me tell everyone about an integral phase, and you know, my significant other can tell you, like, that's the last thing he wants to hear about is integral. But like, when I'm actually embodying that space, there's nothing he's more attracted to. You know, so it's sort of like, people just sort of like that are ready for that sort of like come to it. And so it's like, I struggle with wanting to kind of go in the mental state because I feel like I can control it then, or my version of it. But I was going to ask you about this, Andrew, this idea of like memory, right? It's like when I'm really being present, when I'm really just sort of in the moment and doing from whatever space it being, where I'm engaged and I'm clear about what I need to be doing. But it's sort of like, I don't necessarily remember every aspect of it, I just do it. It's not like I forget it, but I'm just sort of showing up. And so it's like, I feel like I want to just challenge you a little bit on like the beauty of like what you're bringing attention to from the mental space, but also that it's sort of like over valuing that as opposed to the whole. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Do you want to respond?
No, it's okay.
Should I?
Go ahead.
Chime in. Okay. So this is more of an observation of sort of where we are, because, you know, Gebser is writing about this mutation in the 40s and experiencing things in the 30s, and then going through this kind of regression through World War I and World War II, and feeling, yeah, there is this kind of mythic and magical, deficient, I don't know, implosion? What's the opposite of a leap, you know, a fall, a collapse? And here we are again, kind of experiencing that again. And it's not Europe necessarily alone, but it's kind of, it's here, it's Europe, it's just the West, it's just modernity, it's just what we're
Well, it's not just the West. It's not just the West.
It's true.
Right? North Korea is not the West, China's not the West, ISIS isn't the West. I mean, it's not just the West.
I mean, in terms of right now and what's going on with this sort of make America great again,
Right.
you know, Germany for Germans, and this kind of strange rhetoric we're hearing that's shocking. And it kind of gives, at least this is maybe more of an abstract observation, but it gives a shape to these leaps in the sense that it's not just, okay, here's the mental, it's going to become deficient, and then there's going to be an integral leap. Instead, it's okay, there's going to be an attempt at a leap, but it's going to exhaust itself and exhaust itself and exhaust. There's a kind of jaggedness to kind of jumping in which there is a series of implosions and creative reworking of the mental and creative reworking of the deficient magic and mythic before we even get to this integral, you know, and we're still kind of looking and anticipating it. So I'm just kind of bringing that into the picture too, that there's this kind of in-between of the structures that we're living in, where we're getting to see this kind of messiness as, you know, the integral's trying to come through us, but we're also kind of creatively spending a little bit of fuel that's left in the deficient magic and mythic and mental, you know, as it's kind of reifying things with now Trump, you know, is a great example of this sort of, I thought we had exhausted this already, but no, here we are.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's your typical hero's journey plot line in, you know, the movies. The plot is always they can't succeed on the first try, otherwise, you know, you have a 20-minute movie.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Oh, that was great. Well, is Trump succeeding though? I mean, it looks like to me the GOP is sort of melting down, and Trump has betrayed his party already several times. I don't see a unified front, really.
Well, I think this is what Robert's talking about. He's not talking to the GOP.
No, I'm just saying, Trump to me, he always struck me as a cosmopolitan New Yorker. He was a real estate developer. He's not the kind of people who blow up things. You know? I think he can use the rhetoric, though, to try to mobilize people around him. But I think he comes out of Obama and Clinton and this sort of neoliberal failure. So I think we're moving from the difference between globalization and planetarization, isn't that I believe Erwin Thompson? So I think this is the fault line, I guess. We're trying to make a leap across.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
But I think we maybe need to look at the city rather than the nation. And I think the city like New York and other major cities are like Petri dishes for developing these perspective or integral initiatives, and that can have an impact, maybe a small influence, but a larger influence.
It may be. I want to be able to, I want to come back to you, but I want to be able to give him the first shot.
I want to try, I don't know how this is going to happen. I want to try to tie together a couple of things. One of them is your comment on the sort of preliminary nature of these leaps. And I mean, as I said, Gebser, I don't think Gebser's not Kant, right? He's Plutarch, and between Plutarch and Kant, there were 400 years. Things may be getting quicker and quicker, but that still means, we're probably not that quick. Right? The day of somebody who is like the full flowering of what it is that we're talking about is probably not going to happen tomorrow, right? It's not happening right now. Something about what you said in terms of the proof, the integral proof is not rational. We're not proving something, right? We're performing something. And our ability to perform that is in itself attractive. And that performance, I think, to what you're talking about with this idea of, I think we're deeply uncomfortable with how violent we are. Like, even to say that this is shocking. Like, oh my God, Trump is shocking, or people still think this, or I can't believe it. I thought we were done with it. I thought we were over with that. It almost is like, there's like a real politic aspect to this that I think we're deeply uncomfortable with today. That the kind of violence that we need to use to bring a world about is actually creative and it's destructive. We try to push ourselves away from it or stay clean with it, but actually what it is that we need to do. And I love that you mentioned this, 10,000 or whatever, however number it is, but some tiny minority of people who are essentially, because they're able to organize each other and themselves, are able to basically, control the social sphere. And there's something about that we find. I grew up in an upper middle class New Jersey, liberal family. There's something that we find repugnant about that, and yet, to say, oh, we're going to go out tomorrow as this tiny cadre of people and invite everyone into the kind of consciousness that we're talking about, I think is, we're going to be banging our heads against that wall for a very long time before we understand it doesn't work that way. So there's a kind of taking power that I think is possible, that we feel deeply uncomfortable, and yet is almost needed or called for in what it is that we're doing. That kind of, like, it's not a power of us versus them. We're this small group that is going to take everyone over and sort of control what it is that's happening, but the power of us for us, and obviously there's danger in that, and obviously every small group of people has always said that they were doing it for the benefit of the whole and the benefit of everybody, but isn't that possible, and what happens if we don't do that? That's, I think, what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah. I know Kimberly was waiting for Kimberly Part 2, return of Kimberly.
Yeah, I think what I was saying is sort of like the sort of deficient expression we're seeing now, or the regression to more of the tribal mythic. And the intensification that's bringing is helping clarify people's values. At least in my circles, or what I'm seeing is like people are reacting to it two ways. They're holding on more and defining themselves more by their tribe, or that story, that narrative that goes with that identification. Or they're seeing the deficiency of that, and they're clarifying their views from a more holistic view, naturally, because it's just more energizing, it's more true. And of course, there's room for all of that, right? But it's sort of the living proof in the systems that it creates and the relationship that it brings to others, both at that level and in different states. But sort of like, I see this regression as necessary for the intensification. It clarifies things. So I see this like sort of like a really sort of ugly integration process, and it's sort of like a rebirthing process. So it's like the deficient is a regression, but it's also an poor attempt at integration, but it's the best that we can do.
It may be. I mean, Glenn and I were talking about this morning after he said that he thinks that Trump is a blessing, sort of a blessing in disguise, and he made the joke about it's one hell of a disguise, right? And, and I turned him afterwards and I said, it's sort of like I live in Northern California, where we were talking about the hurricane and everything, our big danger is fires. And you know, as awful as a forest fire is necessary for certain seeds to germinate. Like the creation of the new forest is kind of like what we were talking about with the acorn, right? That the new forest is in the fire. And so maybe we're going through the fire right now. I mean, I don't have the answers. This is, like I said, an ongoing multi-year project.
Well, there's two things I want to kind of add to what's being said. One of them is, I think that the answer to the question of what's keeping the mental going for these is much more simple than we think. And it's oil. And it's capitalism. And that's the force, that's the power, that's the outcome of the neoliberal project that leads us to the front. Now, and then the next thing is to say that, you know, in William Irwin Thompson, in his chapter where he discusses Lao Tzu, actually contrasts Gandhi with Aurobindo, and says Gandhi went into politics and couldn't stop the civil war and partition. Aurobindo went into retreat and, as I was saying yesterday, affected world events. And how? Through the concretization of the spiritual. So as much as we're uncomfortable with, I mean, when you say, when one says that somehow we have to, you know, we recognize this deep fear that we have of exercising power. Yeah, if it's not spiritual power, and only spiritual power is going to be the thing that's going to make that possible. And now I can't remember if it was a quote from Gebser or a quote from Aurobindo, but you know, power is, or actually it's from Banerjee, right? Aurobindo recognized that in the exercise of that spiritual power, there's a question of recognizing power, and that's an intrinsic part of the human experience. But it's the integral or supramental exercise of that power, which, in recognizing the immense creativity and aligning oneself with the immense creativity of that awareness, it's harnessing the power of that awareness. That's the spiritual power. That's the Vyakti. That's the true Drishti.
Could I just respond? Because I believe that, I'm sure most of you know that the CIA was funding a remote viewing project, and they had psychics and they trained. They had a really good, interesting training program. And a lot of these people who were in that program have spoken about it, and they were targeting leaders in other countries and trying to kill them. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance among those persons because they felt like they were using their spiritual powers for nefarious purposes. And I think that just needs to be put out there, that we have these powers. Now they can be used in very different ways. And since many of us are becoming more and more psychic, we have to take much more responsibility, as I think you were talking about, in the language that we use, because we are actually creating all kinds of ripple effects. So I think this is a tremendous discipline that we have to develop some cosmo-ethics. And if you just have these powers without the ethics, we're in a really deep shit.
So when esoteric Buddhism came into China, it was successful in the Tang Dynasty. It was successful because the primary architect of esoteric Buddhism in Tang Dynasty China was named Amagavajra, and he was purported to be able to bring these wrathful Hindu-derived deities into action to put down rebellion, and so he gained the ear, as it were, of the imperium. And again, to the center of power versus the barbarian issue. You know, we know that those barbarians were not actually a separate people. It was not the raw and the cooked. It was actually people that were fleeing Corby labor in the center of power and establishing much less hierarchical modes of kinship and governance. That was, you know, so when you go and look at the genes of hill tribes, they're actually Han ethnicity. So again, it's like what you're saying, like the incredible discipline is not to be, Gebser says, the supersession of patriarchy, the supersession of power and hierarchy. Like, he's saying it so clearly.
And are we ready to be transparent?
Right. And
there
are
are
we
things
ready
that
to
I don't want other
recognize?
people to know, and I'm sure they don't want me to know. So
And we're not, because we're on our phones, we're making our flight plans on the phone, and then we're flying across the country.
This is the big challenge, though. I mean, this is what the conference is called. How can we discern globalization from planetization? All of the rights, all of the efforts of the 20th century have been in this mental, rational, or mental, even efficient mental globalization. And it's falling apart. We have to build the world with planetization, with the integral. So everything is retreating. All of the things we've built is built upon an exhausted structure. So of course it's collapsing. So it's like, how do we create a better world that is more decentralized, that is more egalitarian, and still spherical, and still transparent, and still trying to achieve the things that globalization had attempted to achieve, but perhaps, you know, in a more opaque way, pinning down, you know, everything. So this is our big challenge.
So before I sit down, I just want to say thank you very much to Jeremy, to Sabrina, and Mike, right? Steve, without whom any of this would have, you know, worked. So thank you very much to the three of you, and thank you very much. I loved your comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, so the next series of presentations will be recordings, and also possibly a Skype if we can get it to work. So we're going to take a 15-minute break and then reconvene for 2 more.
3 more.
Oh, here. So the non-local participation segment. 15 minutes.
That's the thing. That's when you learn. That's when you learn how.
Yeah.
But I'm glad I heard. I'm now serious. But at the base of the mountain is all massages. Like it's a whole street. And no, I mean, you can get off the mountain, you turn your car back, and you go kind of which is exactly what I did. And lots of it.
He sent me a PowerPoint of 100
No recording.
unless he did it in the last
Send you slides in case we need them, but if he's going to be sad, he can just share his screen.
But then it just occurred to me, I'm there.
I don't think it's
you know, I don't think it's an accident. Out of
that explains not just the Buddhist practices, but also the actual Buddhism that is native to Tibet. And in that Buddhism is and how Buddhism interacted with shamanic tradition that was in Tibet already, which is the Buddhism tradition, and even to this day, Dzogchen is kind of both in possibility and you have this whole side of practices and you just don't find it in any other kind of Buddhism, because essentially Buddhism and Buddhism are the same.
And yet everybody
that's not the way we're going to Japanese tells us it's not real, so don't practice it because you'll get caught in our attachment. So don't pay attention to what's happening there. But I don't think that's right. Our situation is I don't think because we are especially popular. And that's valuable. That's what it's important and will be important, right? Because it's
so you use
I think that's what you're talking about and why you have so many people representing John and talking about
You want to,
because of very good conversation. Oh, you're tagging on.
When I was in New York City, I learned that there's other half. And this is really interesting.
Hi, Mirko.
Hey, what's up?
Hey, how are we?
I see you have some ugly sort of nebula there. Maybe you can try to activate also the video, so I can also see something. Otherwise, it's not important. Too much bandwidth, that's okay.
Can you see us at all? I mean, I guess it's not as important.
No, not at all. I hear you very, very well, which is already encouraging.
Okay, we can see you. Yeah, we actually see you fine. We're just testing the...
Okay, all right. So, if you think there is enough bandwidth so that I also can see you, that's better. Otherwise, it doesn't matter. As long as you put the slides on the wall, I think it should be fine.
Yeah, and it's okay. You don't need to see us anyway.
Right. Perhaps actually it's a better idea that maybe only at the end you show me, the picture there so that I can greet everybody and yada. But for the time being, as long as you hear me and you can see me in all my splendor and glory, that's good enough.
Good. Okay, so that's great. Did you want to try to... we don't have another screen, so it might be easier for you to share your screen on Skype to share your slides.
Oh man, I started hating you. I used to love you up to an hour ago, but now I start really hating you. I mean, yes, I hate you, but this could be really troublesome. This is that we probably will use some, let's see, some additional resources. Are you sure you can put it anywhere?
Also, before we begin,
okay, 1 second, I don't even know how to. Let's see, 1 second.
Yeah. I don't think you can do that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can probably do it, but first of all, I don't even know. I'm using Skype on Ubuntu. Normally, I have my Windows computer myself screwed up, so.
So on Skype, on Ubuntu Skype, does it have a stable on? There should be just a button.
Can you take a picture?
Send file. No, that's not it.
Hold on a second. I see that share screens. Maybe
That's the one that should work.
Okay, let's see.
Okay, now we
see stuff here.
Yes, we see.
But it's kind of ugly. First of all, you're not going to see my splendid face, but maybe you can see at least the slides.
We can see the slides now, yes.
Okay, all right. So I'm ready to roll whenever you like.
Okay, so can we give you a call back in like 10 minutes? We're just taking a 15-minute break right now. and we're like about halfway.
Right now I'm 8 years, so if it's 10 minutes or maybe 12, okay. After 15 I start really, I shift from taking to really taking big time.
All right, I'll try not to make that happen.
Catch you later.
Okay, talk to you in a few. Bye.
So he handed it in his face to his screen.